Hey, how's it going, everybody? This is Trail. On the tail end of Brady's mule deer e-scouting video that he did a couple weeks ago, we wanted to jump in and provide another option, maybe another overview of how somebody else in the office uses the goHUNT maps to do some e-scouting. So today's my turn. I'm going to jump in and kind of run everyone through how I use our maps and how I use e-scouting to find an elk hunting area, and specifically kind of really drill down into an area to find a spot that I actually want to try hunting in. So I'm just going to jump in. I've got the maps pulled up here, as you can see. In order to be able to kind of show you how this works and kind of my process, I don't want to blow anybody's spot out, so I'm going to pick an extremely tough to draw area. So my home state of Utah, right here, sitting in the center, is an extremely tough draw. So hopefully I won't blow anybody's spot out. But I'm going to pick just a limited entry unit in the state of Utah, and then I'm going to drill down and kind of show everyone the process that I go through to find an actual area to go elk hunting. And I use the same process whether I'm looking to hunt in Colorado or Wyoming. I've been going through the same process in Idaho. I've got an over-the-counter tag there in Idaho this year. This is the kind of the same process that I use no matter where I'm starting my e-scouting. So I'm just going to assume that I drew a permit here in Utah. So the first thing I'm going to do is go over here, click on the state of Utah. I'm going to add the hunt units. So click on the hunt units here. As you can see, I have all the options here that are available to me. I'm going to click on the elk limited entry units, and those will add to the maps. After that, I can see all these different other layers that I could potentially add, and I'll touch on those as I kind of start to drill down. But first and foremost, I'm just going to scroll in, show you what the units look like on the map. You can see all the various units that are available to me to do some research. So I'm going to just pick this Fish Lake Plateau Thousand Lake unit. This unit is, I know a little bit about it, but not a ton. I worked on that unit a little bit back in the day, but I've never hunted it for elk. So this will be kind of a fresh look to me as far as looking at it from, fresh eyes. All right, so I'm going to do some scouting, some e-scouting on this Plateau Fish Lake Thousand Lake unit. I know a little bit about this unit. I've never hunted it for big bulls before, so it's new to me. I'll have some new eyes to this unit. A little bit, maybe I should preface before I even get started. I would suggest that whether you're starting e-scouting for mule deer or antelope or elk, no matter the species, you got to know a little bit about that species and where you might find those animals on any given time of year. Elk, for example, I know that they're, a big animal. They're a generalist as far as diet goes. They can eat a lot of different vegetation, but they like that green grass. So, I'm looking for areas that have good feed. I know that early on in the season, particularly, August, September timeframe, it's hot still. So, elk are probably looking for those big shaded out north-facing slopes where they can bed for the day. Water is super important to an elk. They've got to water every day, especially when those bulls start to rutting and they're expending a bunch of energy and it gets hot. They need water absolutely every day. Elk wallows is another thing that I kind of key in on, and I use that quite a bit during archery elk season. Those bulls will come in and hit a wallow from the first part of September all the way through the rut. Those bulls will come in and hit those wallows. So, a wallow on a map for me is something that I'm always looking for, and that's like a key piece of my e-scouting strategy is to kind of find those wet meadows and those wallows. So primarily, for archery elk hunting, I'm looking at areas that are, potentially that upper, third in elevation. If there's above timberline, I probably won't find them a bunch above timberline, but I will find them like right at timberline. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the terrain and the elevation bands that we have built into our maps. But those are all kinds of things that I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of water, I'm thinking of cover, I'm thinking of feeding and bedding areas. Those are the kinds of things that I think you got to be aware of and you got to be looking for. Also, trails, roads, access, that kind of thing. So before I get too much deeper into that, you can see here I've got the unit pulled up here. One of the first layers that I'm going to look at, and it's typically one of the first things I do when I start scouting a new area, is to look for the wildfire layer. The reason I do that is because elk are attracted to fires because of the feed that rebounds. Ideally, I think the fire that's maybe 2 to 5, 6 years old is probably the most productive to those animals. Um, but even as far back as maybe 10 years can be beneficial. So I'm just going to throw that layer on, and that's going to give me an idea on if there's any fires that have burned in that unit that I'm starting to scout. I can see that I've got some on the neighboring unit here, but I don't see anything popping up in this unit that I'm planning on scouting. So I'm probably not going to leave that layer on and worry too much about it anymore. Um, if there were some burns in here, I would definitely want to focus on those, especially if they're up in elevation like I can see right here on this neighboring unit. That's an area I would want to take a look at first and foremost. So since there's not any that are popping up here on this unit, I'm just going to X out of that. So those are kind of disappear and gone. One of the next layers I typically look at is going to be the terrain. So I want to kind of check out the elevations of this unit. So I may throw on this 11.5, the 10 to 11.5, 11,500. I just kind of want to get a lay of the topography and what that elevation is like. So I can see this unit, I've got a good chunk of country that's going to be that 8,500 feet, to maybe 11.5, 10,000 feet. I typically find elk kind of, at timberline or below timberline, kind of that band that sits just below timberline. So if that timberline is, 10,500 feet, I typically find them right there below it. Maybe the next 1,000, 1,500 feet. So I do use those elevation bands to just kind of give me a lay of the land and what those look like. I can adjust the transparency there so I can kind of see through that and see what that looks like. Before I get too much farther, I'm going to click over here on the 3D portion, which is going to allow me to tilt and pan and kind of zoom into this unit and just kind of give me a better idea of what the lay of the land might look like. I can see I've got some high mountain lakes here. I'm just going to toggle back and forth to see. It doesn't look like I have too much that's above that 11,500 feet. I can see right there, I've got quite a bit between that 10 and 11.5, and it looks like a fair amount of that is kind of above, could be above timberline. You can kind of see these edges here as they run. Oh, that's interesting right there, that big wallow, big wet meadow complex right there. Interesting. Okay, so I kind of get a lay of the land a little bit, but by just using those layers. I would say any of this country right here that I've got highlighted, both the 8,500 to 10, and then also the 10,000 to 11,500 foot, that's all going to be particularly interesting to me when I'm looking for elk, especially archery elk hunting. Not to say that you couldn't get some elk that push out into this lower elevation, especially as those bulls start to rut. Often they'll peel cows off and kind of push them to lower elevations, to kind of get some solitude, maybe keep them from other bulls. But for the most part, I think this is the type of area I'm going to focus my efforts on. Before I get too much further, I do want to take like a look at the land ownership of any given unit that I'm scouting, just to see like what might be possible, available to me. So I'm going to go over here and click on the government land. I'll just click on that real quick so that I can get a brief lay of the land, just kind of give me an idea on where I might be able to hunt. It looks like there is a bunch of national forest. It looks like there's some BLM. It does look like there's a couple of big private parcels chunks here in this end of the unit, kind of the north end of the unit, and also right here. If I wanted to, I could turn on the private land layer and get an idea of who these landowners are. If I thought I might want to hunt that country, potentially I could go that route. But I would say that there's more than enough public land. I mean, almost the entire top of this unit is Forest Service. The only chunks that I probably really need to be aware of, that would kind of be off limits to hunting would be these portions here, which not a big deal. It looks like there's actually a ton of country here that you can hunt, without ever getting onto private land. So I'm just going to kind of click that on and off to give me an idea of what I'm looking at as far as land ownership layers go. As I look at this, I'm kind of starting to like key in on areas that might be, interesting to start to scout and check out. So, as I look at those, I'm looking here, this area here, potentially over here on these borders. This whole range right here above Fish Lake looks interesting, especially this backside portion is starting to kind of look interesting to me. And again, I'm just kind of taking like a 30,000-foot view, Thousand Lake down here. This flat top country looks kind of interesting around the edges of it. I'm just kind of starting to take inventory, like that 30,000-foot view, and kind of starting to identify some areas that I want to really drill down and start to do some research on. So I'm going to click off government land, and again, I can come back to that. I can adjust the transparency right there at the top corner, as you can see, but I'm going to click that off at this point just so I can start to look at the actual ground itself. As I look down through here, there may be some other layers that I want to turn on and just check out, including, water is one. So I want to take a look at the springs, the rivers, the streams. I definitely want to note those on a map because those can be, really important key areas for elk. A couple other layers that I might want to take a look at would be roads and trails. I'm going to turn that layer on just so it's going to give me an idea of where the roads and trails, as well as, what ones are, vehicular access versus, it might be foot travel only. So that's going to give me an idea on what the access might be like and also what the hunting pressure could be like. One of the other things I'm going to look at would be where'd it go? Land usage. Nope, not that one. Although that one could be important, but I'm not going to look at it right now. What's trails access? That's probably a good starting point for now. So, like I said, I'm starting to really pick apart, find some areas that I think might be interesting to me. Again, like I said, I'm looking for areas that are kind of at the right elevation. I'm looking at access, I'm looking at roads and trails, and I'm also starting to look for, feeding, bedding areas, kind of mosaics, and then, like I said, water in particular. It is nice that you've got this tilt pan function. It's super easy to use on this goHUNT maps. And I'm really just going to start cruising these areas and start picking them apart and looking for areas that I think look elky. I can see here I've got a high mountain lake here with a basin, it looks like, running underneath it. As I zoom in here, I'm starting to see some things that might be interesting to me. So like this big wet meadow here, I can see what looks like it could be a giant wallow out in the middle of that. I've got a couple of wet meadows off the edge of this here. It looks like that's definitely had some water in it. And as I cruise down through these drainages, I'm starting to look for things like wet meadows and wallows and that kind of thing. I won't get too crazy at this point for, dropping waypoints and stuff. I definitely want to like get a lay of the land before I get too crazy in dropping, waypoints. I will get to that later on, but for the most part right now, I'm just really kind of starting to look at areas and identify, where the roads and trails are, the access, and then, starting to look for areas that I think just look elky. And again, like I said, elky is just, you kind of got to get there by, some experience in the woods, but then also, just kind of identifying and knowing like life history of elk. So, where do they bed? Big north-facing slopes. What do they eat? They need some of that mosaic-y meadow stuff for feed and cover for bedding. So you're just kind of starting to put together like a portfolio of where you think elk might be. So I'm looking at that kind of country. As I look through here, this is starting to look super interesting to me up in this area. You can see it looks like I've got some wet meadows here. Definitely looks like I got a big wet meadow there with potentially a wallow out in the middle of that. Let's see. I've got some big north-facing slopes here above these lakes that look like they could be good bedding areas. It looks like I do have a road that runs all the way out into this, which is not, it's a short hike up into this. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be elk up in there. There certainly could, especially in, Utah, where I know that there's a lot of roads and trails in most areas of the unit. But, I do like to try to get myself away from roads and trails if I can help it. Let's see. So this whole face is looking pretty interesting. One thing I do like to do often, kind of help to give me a lay of the land, is I will often toggle back and forth between the topography layer and satellite layer. I do like to look at a topo map just because it helps me to kind of identify benches. Often there will also be like ponds or seeps or springs identified on these maps where it might be easier to see than it is on an aerial imagery. So I'm just kind of looking again, just familiarizing myself with the area. One thing I'm looking for is kind of some benches and flats. I can see this country here. I've got some great big benches here between these two lakes. And I will kind of toggle back and forth between the topography and the satellite map to kind of get an idea. Looks like I got a big road right there. So it's just Salina Reservoir, looks like. This is probably not something I'm going to find elk in, but I am looking for those types of areas where I've got those big benches. And that one looks interesting right there. Up in here, you've got these lakes. So this is definitely an area that looks interesting. You've got a big lake underneath the rim here. You've got a big wet meadow right there. It's adjacent to cover and feed. It's an interesting looking spot, even though you've got some roads and trails that are adjacent to that. I often look for areas that are like this, that are kind of a mosaic. You can see you've got a lot of edge habitat here where you're going to have feed for those elk, and then also bedding cover as well. So I do like to find those mosaic-y edge type habitats. Interesting. So again, I'm just looking, I'm just cruising the unit, I'm familiarizing myself with it, with what it looks like. It looks like there are roads and trails through the bottoms of almost all of these drainages. As such, my anticipation would be that you're probably not going to have, elk out in the middle of these flats because those are going to see vehicular access. So you're probably going to have, elk kind of up onto these slopes. And in saying that, I mean, there are some areas that looks like, those elk could be tucked away up in. Interesting. Just gonna. All right, so I've been looking around a little bit on this map and kind of been fine-tuning and drilling down onto some areas that I think I might want to start really, dropping waypoints and really looking at where I might think I'm going to hunt and find some elk. One of the areas that kind of popped up to me as I was cruising along was this big drainage right here, kind of runs in on the backside. I know that I've got a big lake here. It looks like there's a bunch of development right here. But this drainage, I don't see any access other than potentially, the top end here. It looks like there might be a trail that comes in across the top, which is this National Forest Road. The actual drainage itself, as I look at it, looks like, it may be foot travel only. As I tuck down into this little area, I can see all these little wet meadows, all these little ponds that are kind of sitting out in these individual little open meadows. Those are all going to be really interesting to me. It also looks to me like if I'm doing some early season scouting, I could access potentially the top end of this. I could hike out onto the end of these knolls, here, and I could glass a bunch of this lower country through the bottom here. So I would go through and probably start dropping pins on these. I don't get too crazy about, you know, naming each individual, wallow or whatever it is. I just will typically drop a pin. I may name it just Wallow 1, Wallow 2, Wet Meadow 3. These are all just like, I don't get too crazy about it. So I'm just going to do, Wet Meadow 1. I could change this to, a different icon if I wanted to, like a water source. I could do it white or whatever color. I do typically try to do, if I'm going to do, water, I'll do, like a light blue or a medium blue just to identify it very quickly as water. I could add notes here if I wanted to, but where I'm brand new in the process, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to save the point and kind of move on. I could go through and I would probably start dropping pins on each one of these. So all these little wet meadows and lakes, I would probably be interested in checking those out. And again, if I was just going into this unit and hunting it, I might hike in there and just check it out. But if I was scouting, these might all be areas I'd want to stick a trail camera on. That one right there, you can see how it's kind of tucked away up into this flat. That one looks really interesting to me. It looks like an excellent opportunity to ambush a herd of elk on, as they come across the top. So that's one area that looks interesting to me. Again, I'm not going to get too crazy about dropping waypoints or, measuring distances or anything like that. I might further along as I really start to pick apart an area. But what I'm doing basically is just starting to kind of look across these drainages and really kind of fine tuning and finding areas that I might want to check out. That looks like a really interesting option to check out. You can see I've got a seep or a spring, a wet meadow right there. I've got some big timber country, which would be great for bedding. I've got these meadows up through the top end of this drainages, which should look like they'd be great for feeding. Those are kind of tucked in off the top of the main plateau, which is interesting. That looks like an excellent option to hunt. So again, I'm not going to get too crazy about dropping a bunch of waypoints just for the sake of this demo, but you can really start to see as I cruise through here the types of areas that I'm looking for and that I think look elky. And if I find areas that I think look good, I may go in and like drop a polygon on that area just so I can quickly identify it. I can show you how I do that here. As I cruise across this, I'm just looking for other areas that I think look interesting. Yeah, so this big wet meadow right here, this big lake kind of tucked in back underneath this basin looks interesting. Looks like a lot of this is, fairly glassable. And like I said, there's roads that run up most of these. So you can use these roads as jump off points. It looks like you could cruise out to the rim of one of these and glass all this country here. Man, this whole face right here looks really good. I may want to cruise out here on the end of this knoll and, park myself up a morning and do some early morning glassing and just scout this country out. It would let me know within, 1 or 2 days whether there's any elk in that country at all. All right, so I've been cruising around a little bit on this map. I've taken the elevation layer back off just so I can start to see the ground once again. As I cruise around this unit, I can see that there's a ton of access. There's pretty much roads, everywhere you go on this entire unit. It's almost daunting, the number of roads. I know that there's elk in this unit. It's actually one of the largest elk herds in Utah. So I know there's a bunch of elk, but as I look at this, the access is really good. So I know that I'm probably never going to be more than, 2 miles off of a road. In saying that, I kind of identified that that's just going to be the case. And so, getting away from people, getting away from roads and trails isn't necessarily going to be, an option for me. So the other, the next best thing that I can kind of do is look for areas where I think those elk are going to kind of pull off into. maybe potentially get away from pressure. And at that point, I'm kind of looking at some of these deeper canyons that run off to the north. As I look at this whole face right here, I can see, I've got a bunch of mosaic, I've got a bunch of vegetation, and I like this country that kind of is tucked up underneath the rim. All these little north-facing pockets here where you've got these wet meadows kind of tucked back in up underneath the rim. Those all look good. That big water hole looks excellent. Again, I'm just going to drop waypoints as I'm going along scouting. I'm not a guy that gets super crazy about naming all my waypoints and really starting to, fine tune all that until I get later on the process. Usually what I want to do is kind of find the area that I want to hunt, with the waypoints on the map, on my offline downloaded maps. And I'll kind of start to work those just to see, what's out there. I will often, just label them as what it is, like a wet meadow or a wallow, but I don't necessarily get too crazy about, naming and identifying. As I look through this country right here, this all looks really good to me. Like I said, you've got these big open timbered, these big faces that are timbered, which look like they're excellent for bedding. You've got these adjacent meadows, which look really good too. You also looks like you've got some access. So, looks like you can come in from this end, from the south. You could park at the rim. At that point, I could hunt this whole face. It also looks like I could come in underneath if I wanted to. I could hunt across this whole face here. You've got roads that come up the bottom of this side. All that's accessible. All of it's glassable. All of it you ought to be able to easily get to and hunt within a day. But as I look across this landscape, this stuff right here looks probably some of the most intriguing stuff to me. And again, access, there's tons and tons of access in this area, it looks like. So like I said, I like this area. One of the things that I will often do is, like I said, go back, I'll check the land ownership layer just to make sure that I'm good to go on land ownership. I'm not going to be on somebody's private land. So I may take a look at this government land just to make sure that I'm good to go. Looks like that hunk is private, which makes good sense because it looks like good habitat. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That actually could be a decent thing where you've got this country that sits right on the edge of this private. You do have these little lakes and meadows that are kind of tucked away back up in here above that. It is the case sometimes where those elk will push onto private for refuge. But that necessarily doesn't discourage me. Actually, I'm still super interested in that country as I look around here. Looks like good elk habitat. Like I said, also that private property is going to provide some refuge for those animals. I may drop a polygon on that country. So I'm going to go up here, click on, the polygon. I may just draw a quick polygon to identify an area. And again, that's just to kind of save the area. I could, name it possible elk spot. I could add this to a collection. So if I wanted to build a collection here, I could name the collection and I could add it, Fish Lake Elk Hunt, and I could add that to my hunt collection so that I've got a full hunt collection when I'm done with this. So that's kind of the process I go through. It's not super technical. I've covered waypoints, polygons. I don't get too crazy into like measuring distances like you might when you're hunting, mule deer or antelope, when you're talking about glassing areas and you're really trying to figure out those distances from where your glassing points are. Mostly for like an archery elk hunt, the things that I'm most concerned with are finding elk. Once I find the elk, I kind of figure out the area on my own when I get there. I'm not the best e-scouter. I don't spend a ton of time e-scouting. My process for e-scouting is very similar to what I showed you here today. Typically, it's just cruising the landscape, looking at the lay of the land. I'm trying to find areas that are, if I can, this area I couldn't necessarily, but I'm looking for areas that are a little bit removed. I'm looking for areas that have got some north-facing timber pockets. I'm looking for areas with water. I'm looking for areas with feed. I like this area here, like I said, because it sits on the backside of this private parcel. The private parcel itself looked like it had really good elk habitat in it. For me, that's really interesting. You might harbor some elk. You may be able to hunt the borders of this country and do really well. Same with the western border here, even though you do have some roads. You've got these big canyons that kind of run down through this, but there's definitely some interest in that country. Again, the other area I kind of identified is this big drainage here as it runs back through. You do have, like I said, you've got a trail that kind of runs up through it, but you do have some really good looking elk habitat. It is a big canyon, which I like. Again, you've got bedding, feeding areas, and water, which are really, the three items that all elk need, cover, water, and food. So that's kind of the process I go through. I would typically spend a few hours picking apart this landscape and looking for areas that look elky. I'd probably do some calling and some connecting with area biologists or maybe other hunters if I can find them that have hunted the area. I would say typically within an hour or two, I can put together a pretty good idea of where I think the elk are most likely to be in any given area, just by using the different layers that we've talked about: elevation bands, water trails, fire layers if there were any fires in this area. And then after that, really, it's just me getting out on the landscape and hunting. I will label these areas, A, B, C, and D, which is kind of my plan based on, what I think is the best possible spot. If that doesn't pan out, I'll go to plan B, plan C, and plan D. But you always want to go into the field with multiple options of hunting just in case the first choice doesn't pan out. That's kind of how I would tackle this. Again, this is a different kind of scenario. The Fish Lake, any limited entry elk unit in Utah, you're looking for elk, and you're probably going to find them no matter where you look. But you are also looking for probably a particular caliber of bull, which brings in a whole other realm, because at that point you're covering country and looking for the biggest bull you can find. If I were just going to tackle this area as like opportunity type of hunt, it's a lot easier, because then you're just looking for areas that you think are going to hold some elk and not necessarily concerned with trophy potential. This drainage looks interesting actually as I look at it. It looks like you got a bunch of aspen in the top end of it. You have a big bowl that runs back up underneath this peak. You've got a nice mosaic. It looks like you got some feed in the top end of it. And other than the road that runs into the bottom, doesn't look like maybe there's a lot of access, but that's another area that looks pretty interesting. Anyway, so that's kind of my process. Again, it's not the most tedious. I don't spend a lot of time e-scouting. I typically, find a few areas, put a plan together based on where the access is, and just go in there and figure it out on the go. I'm sure that there's a lot of folks out there that are probably a lot more picky, Brady included. And again, I would tackle this differently if I were planning an e-scout for a mule deer hunt. It's a different species. At that point, glassing becomes everything, and you're really starting to pick apart the landscape for glassing points and where you think you might find deer. Anyway, that's kind of my process. Not super scientific. Typically, just find some areas. I think look elky, label them. All the water, wet meadows, wallows, those kinds of things, I definitely label. But then it's just getting out there on the landscape and going hunting and seeing how it goes. So that's it for me.